Today's workshop is Regulating at Home. I'm excited to introduce you to Natalie Manhers, who is a pediatric occupational therapist, piano teacher, ski coach, human developer, and a mother of 2 young boys. She was the founder of 2 private therapy practices in Boulder, Colorado for 9 years before moving back to her Vermont hometown in 2021. Natalie specializes in sensory integration. She is constantly expanding her view of neurodivergence as she parents her neurodivergent child. Natalie identifies as neurodivergent with an ADHD diagnosis. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And Natalie, I'll turn things over to you.
Okay. All right, let me just share my screen here. And 1 second. Make sure that this is okay. Hello, thank you so much for having me. So today we're going to talk about regulating at home, dysregulation versus regulation, behaviors and choice, what you can do at home. Towards the end, I'm going to talk specifically about nighttime routine, because that's something that I think we all struggle with, regardless of how our child presents. And then I'm just going to go through regulation patterns that you can pick up on, where to start with your child if you're looking to help them regulate at home, and just some things to do. And like, she said, I will be answering questions at the end. So I'm going to start talking about what regulation and dysregulation look like. So when we think of regulation, we can think of it as a band like this. And when we have a child who struggles with regulation or has a regulation disorder, like a self-regulation disorder or a modulation disorder, I'm going to turn this little notification off. When we have that, their bandwidth for regulation is usually a lot smaller. So it's like this. And so when I think of maybe like a typical person who does not struggle with regulation, their bandwidth is like this. And typically throughout the day, they're able to stay within that regulated zone. And as adults, especially, we have a lot of compensatory strategies, like we drink coffee, we go and exercise, we can get up and leave. Children a lot of times do not have that, especially when they're younger. The younger the child, the less compensatory strategies that they have. Also, the less compensatory strategies they've been exposed to. So when they are dysregulated, it's just they're full on dysregulated. They don't go and get a cup of coffee. They typically, if they're in school, they're not allowed to get up and move around. So they don't have quite as much freedom as we do as adults, and they might not understand exactly what they need also to stay regulated. So we think of that bandwidth, we kind of shrink it down like this. And instead of staying within that bandwidth throughout the day, they're kind of going way up and then way down like this. So they can be kind of all over the place. And a lot of times when we're parenting a child who struggles with self-regulation, it kind of can feel like that. It can feel all over the place. Sometimes it feels very unpredictable. And what we have to remember is dysregulation is not a choice. It has to do with the nervous system. And we all struggle with dysregulation, but like I said, a lot of us can stay within that zone. And kids without the compensatory strategies and the way that their nervous system is designed, they're going way out of their regulation zone. And so what we're going to talk about today is what you can do as a parent or as a figure at home to really support them to stay within that regulated zone for as long a period of time as we can. So when we think of dysregulation, because it's not a choice and it involves the nervous system, there are actually signs that you can look for in your child. And those are signs that the autonomic nervous system is activated. And so the child's pupils will dilate. They'll often get flushed. I know for my son, he like profusely sweats when he's dysregulated, very hot. A lot of times the ears will get red, heart rate will increase, and respiratory rate will increase. And so it's like going into that fight, flight, freeze where they're reacting. They're in this survival mode. And so if you're unsure if your child is dysregulated or regulated, you can look for those signs. Now, that being said, going from regulated to dysregulation is not like a switch, it's a spectrum. And so I can be a little bit dysregulated, I can be very dysregulated. When I'm very dysregulated, or my son is very dysregulated, he is sweating, he is red, he is screaming, he is crying. Now, it's along that point, he can be, I'm going to back it up a little bit, he could be anxious about something and still be a little bit dysregulated. So he might be not necessarily like pupils dilated, but he might be on edge. So when we wait, oftentimes this is what we do because we're not sure what to do. And when our child becomes dysregulated, It's not like one thing, it's a bunch of little things that add up over time. So sometimes it can be very hard to pinpoint when our child is becoming dysregulated or what's happening to their system. But if we back up and they're slowly becoming dysregulated, that's really when we're going to be implementing the home program. If we wait until they're crying and screaming on the floor and they're sweating, there's not a lot that we can do in that moment to really support their regulation other than just like be there for them when they're having that meltdown. So this is going to be more about how do we back up? What signs are we looking for? When we look for the actual sign of dysregulation, we see that their pupils are dilated, we see that they're sweating. That's almost too late if we're going to try to support their regulation in a very preventative and consistent way. Okay, so what I would like you to do, if you feel free to share or put it in the chat, is think about or close your eyes and even think about what your child looks like when they're dysregulated. What do you typically do? And this is really hard as parents also, because when our child is dysregulated and they're sitting on the floor and they're screaming or they're kicking and biting, all of these things I've experienced myself, it is very hard not to become dysregulated ourselves and go into fight or flight ourselves. And so it can be hard to kind of think. When we're dysregulated, we're not thinking. Nothing's going up past our brainstem into our cortex. So if my son is really dysregulated and I'm there, I'm also just dysregulated and reacting. And that can take kind of some practice on our own nervous system, on our own sort of emotional state, what's going on for us. So it can be helpful just to close your eyes. And if you're listening to the recording, even pause it and do this and think about, what do you typically do? How do you typically react? And what does it look like when you're saying, okay, my child is dysregulated? And I don't know if anybody shared in the chat.
Yes, we have raises voice and cheeks become red.
Yes.
When I'm working with dysregulated students, they swear, kick, and try to flee.
Yes, exactly. And I'll go into what that might mean in terms of their regulation pattern. But that's usually what it looks like. And that's when they're really dysregulated. So on the spectrum of dysregulated, like little things have been happening to them throughout maybe like hours, maybe minutes. Sometimes our dysregulation system can kind of kick in really fast. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. And so then when you get to that point, you're like, oh, they're obviously dysregulated. They're trying to run away. They're sweating, they're swearing, they're kicking, they're fighting. That's when they're very dysregulated. And so just taking a moment, because sometimes we as parents, especially, it's very hard to track. Even me as a therapist and a mom who I feel like should be on top of this. If someone asked me, well, what do you usually do when your child is regulated or dysregulated, excuse me, my first reaction would be like, I have no idea, because historically I would be dysregulated and I can't remember then. I can't recall because my thinking brain wasn't working at the time. So it can be just helpful to notice what you do and what your child's doing so that then you can start to back it up as we go into creating this home program. Okay. So I'm going to play this little video for a home program. So when we're talking about a home program, I think that can be kind of a fancy word. How I'm using it here is if your child has a self-regulation disorder, where perhaps they can hold it together sometimes and then they fall apart other times. So the typical presentation would be that the child holds it together during school. They can pay attention, they're there, they're present, there's really no issues. And then at home, they get home and they just sort of like unleash everything. They no longer can hold it together. Their brain cannot handle anything more and they're dysregulated at home. That's like a self-regulation disorder. That can also be a modulation disorder, where the child's brain is not really ever able to get into a regulated state. So they're always dysregulated. And this is what we kind of identify as when the brainstem has problems processing information, and the brainstem is in charge of keeping us safe and like our survival. And so when information is going through a brainstem and it's not processing efficiently, the outcome can be a self-regulation disorder or a modulation disorder. And also that's a spectrum too, right? So keep that in mind. So I'm going to talk about here in the video just what a home program is. It's not for developing motor skills or specific kind of like school-related skills. This is for specifically supporting regulation as it pertains to a brainstem dysregulation issue. And I say that because we can also become dysregulated when we're faced with a skill that's really hard for us. So if handwriting is really hard for me, or it's really hard for my child, and they're doing handwriting,
after maybe 10 minutes, they might become dysregulated because it's so hard for them. They're frustrated. They have no confidence. They can't do it anymore, and they kind of lose it. I can also be in a place where I'm really angry and I stay angry for long enough that I become dysregulated. This home program is not going to help with that. However, because we all fluctuate on this regulation dysregulation scale, these techniques and using a home program will support everybody's regulation in the home just by flooding the brains with these neurochemicals that we need to stay regulated. Okay, but if you're using it to help with homework, that might not be effective, because that could be like a skill related more problem. So let me play this.
And we start talking about what to do at home. A lot of times the term home program will get thrown around, or you'll hear that program. And so essentially what it is when you go see an occupational therapist, they will come up with a home program, a program to do at home, because the idea is that if you go to therapy, your child goes to therapy, you have that appointment for once a week, maybe twice a week for about an hour. Now, the rest of the time, your child is with you, right? So that's all of the other hours of the day. So really the most important person, the most influential person, the most significant person in the child's life is going to be the parents and caregivers. And so the idea is that when the child is at home, when they're in your presence, you are able to do things to help regulate your child in a way, and it should always be in a way where you feel more connected to your child. That's something that works for you and your child. So it shouldn't be something that is a program that just adds more stress. It's just something you have to do, and sometimes it can feel like that. So just be mindful if you do see an occupational therapist for your child of the home program, and make sure you advocate for your needs. Like, what can you do realistically, and what's the priority, and making sure that you're asking questions like that, because a lot of times it's very easy just to say, yes, okay, I get it, and then go home and be like, none of this works. And so having a therapist where you have this ongoing conversation and you're really able to say, like, I don't have this much time, like I have about 20 minutes, like what can I do in 20 minutes? My goals for me are really to connect with my child and play. Like, how can I play and help my child stay regulated or promote their self-regulation? And so the idea behind a home program really should be that. And so those are the things to think about when you are going into a home program. Now in here, I just outlined.
Okay, so that is sort of what a home program is. Now, some of you might be thinking, you know, I don't even have 20 minutes.
3 minutes, I have 5 minutes. You can adapt what I'm going to go over in any amount of time. So it's not about necessarily the amount of time that you're doing it. It's about finding something that's going to work for you, that feels good for you, that you're connecting with your child on, that you can do easily with the stuff that you have in the home. You don't have to go out and buy a trampoline or go out and buy a swing. And if you already have, that's great. But a lot of this, when you understand why you're doing something, you will find things in your home that you can use very easily to get basically the job done in terms of supporting regulation. And like I said before, it is for the whole family. You can do this with siblings. Now, will it work the same on siblings? Probably not. If you remember that when you have a child with a self-regulation disorder or self-regulation difficulties, and you have that lower kind of bandwidth, that lesser bandwidth, a little bit goes a long way. And when I've seen in my practice kids who struggle with this, it seems like a little bit goes even longer, like a huge amount. So when I do like a minute to 3 minutes of an activity where I know it's flooding the brain with a certain neurochemical, and I'm going to get into this, it has a huge impact. So when you have a sibling who's more neurotypical and you do this, it might not have this huge impact. It might have a little bit of impact. So you're not going to hurt anybody. You're not going to promote any sort of dysregulation with this if you do it with your neurotypical peers or siblings or whatever, but it might have an even bigger impact on your child. And part of this is when you do a home program is afterwards, you're going to be a scientist and just think, okay, like, how did that impact my child? How did that impact their behavior, their well-being? Like, what do I see and for how long? And if you do it and there's nothing, I'll kind of get into that too, but don't be afraid to try this. You're not going to kind of reverse anything or do any harm at all. Okay, so so to create this kind of home program, I'm going to be talking about regulating patterns. So It's when we have a child who has a self-regulation issue, a lot of times what is missed is figuring out what their pattern is. And so we might go to an occupational therapist and they might start doing a home program, and they might assign you a home program. Oftentimes what can be missed is the understanding of why I'm doing this, when I'm supposed to do it, and what's going on for my child's brain. Like, what's the purpose of what I'm doing? And so if we back up, everybody has this regulation pattern that you are born with. And when you think about your child, especially ages like 3 to 5, where they don't have any compensatory strategies, and typically they're not on any medications, because medication can mask sort of a regulation pattern. You think of a child who perhaps is diagnosed with ADHD and they're taking Ritalin, that will mask kind of like their ADHD-ness, right? So think about your child when they're very young, and they kind of present in these 2 different ways. And this is how our brainstem processes information. When you think of what I said about how the brainstem is in charge of safety, what happens when you have a brainstem that's not processing information effectively is either all the information is allowed through, or kind of the brainstem is stopping everything and alerting you to everything. And what this is called is you either have an overwhelm brainstem, or what I call it, and an underwhelm brainstem. In an overwhelm brainstem, I like to use this analogy of a policeman with a stop sign. So think of your brainstem, there's a policeman there with a stop sign. And for an overwhelm brainstem, this is a brainstem that gets very overwhelmed very easily. So in this case, the policeman is stopping every single car, every single thing that's kind of coming in, every neurochemical that's coming through the brainstem, stopping it, all the information, and looking inside the car, making everybody get out. It's taking forever. Everything seems to be a safety issue for this policeman. So they're just stopping every single thing, and there's a huge backup of cars. At some point, there's such a big backup that people in the car start getting angry, and then there's sort of like this explosion, like they get really mad, they want to go, they don't understand like what's going on. And that's basically what happens inside an overwhelmed brainstem. And you'll see, I'll tell you in the next slide exactly what that presents like. For an underwhelmed brainstem, using that same analogy, you have a policeman who isn't paying attention, is letting all the cars go through. And at some point, so many cars go through that the policeman's like, oh yeah, and like starts stopping maybe like one car. And then they're like, oh, and then there's like this really fancy car. So they stop that car because that caught their attention. Or maybe there's like a really big like monster truck, and they're like, oh, that's different, I'll stop that one and check it out. So there's always this information coming through, but the brainstem's not paying attention. The policeman's kind of sleepy. And it takes like a lot to get that policeman's attention. And so for a child with an underwhelmed brainstem, it takes a lot for them to get alert and to be able to be present in a way where they're paying attention, like just not like cognitively paying attention, but just like I'm aware of my environment, I'm aware of what I'm doing, that kind of thing. Now, for an overwhelmed brainstem, this is what it looks like. So this is like the behavior associated with it. So I have this overwhelmed brainstem. My brainstem's supposed to keep me safe. And in this case, it's looking around, all the information that's coming in, it's saying, I'm unsafe, I'm unsafe, I'm unsafe. And so this is like, it reminds me of if I was going to go to a new city and I'm driving around and I don't have my phone and I have the directions in my head, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm going in. It's getting nighttime, and the kids in the back start talking. And I'm like, I can't handle anything else. I have to focus so hard on where I'm going and what I'm doing. I can't take in anything else. And I just have this level of being on edge. I just have this like kind of over alertness. Not that I'm thinking it, but my body and my brain is only focused on one thing because I don't feel very safe. Okay, that's what it reminds me of. So initially you'll have a child who has this overwhelmed brainstem pattern, whose brainstem is telling them that they're always unsafe. And so at first, what you'll see typically is the child will try to avoid this information. They'll try to avoid the input. So for example, if there's a loud sound, it's a very easy example. A loud sound, they'll cover their ears, they'll hide under the table, they'll try to get away from it. Now, if this doesn't work, like there's a fire alarm, this doesn't work, they're under the table with their ears covered, they can still hear it, then they might start getting kind of aggressive. They might go into this fight state. So they tried to flight away, and get away from it. They couldn't, and so now they're in this fight mode. And it can look like lashing out, kicking, screaming, yelling, hitting, all of those things that we typically associate with like a meltdown. or we typically associate with being dysregulated. This is like a very kind of typical presentation when we talk about dysregulation. So what does this brainstem need when it's overwhelmed? It needs things that are predictable. It needs things that are rhythmic. It needs things that are the same. So this is a child who might look like they're very controlling because they have to control their environment because nothing feels safe for them. So if nothing feels safe for me, what am I going to control? Well, I'm going to try to control what's on my plate. I'm going to try to control what pillow I sleep on. I'm going to try to control all these little things. They might be called bossy or controlling. That might be that you feel like as a parent, you're walking around on eggshells because you don't know when the child's going to melt down. You don't know when they're going to get dysregulated. And you're just not sure. You have to have the eggs in the right plate with the grape and they can't be touching. And then you brought the wrong fork over. And then, you know, everything can feel like, unless it's exactly in the same order for this child or the right order for them, they cannot handle it. Their brainstem cannot handle it because it feels so unsafe that they are trying to control everything. And that's what that behavior is. Okay. Let me go to the next one. So an underwhelm brainstem. Whoopsie. There we go. Nope. There we go. Okay. So an underwhelm brainstem is the opposite. And this is typically where you see like an ADHD diagnosis. So what happens here is the brainstem's asleep. So it's not on high alert, like with an overwhelmed brainstem, it is under alerted. It's trying to fall asleep. It's not awake. And so if the child's not awake, their brainstem's like, okay, let's wake up. We have to wake up. And we do this as adults, like you're listening to this lecture and let's say it's very boring. You're going to be tapping your foot. You're going to be doodling with your pencil. You're going to be getting a glass of water. Your brainstem subconsciously is trying to wake you up, right? And this happens not just when things are boring for this child, but just in daily life. So it's kind of a constant trying to wake your brainstem up. Just like with overwhelmed brainstem, it's like a constant, I'm not safe feeling. So you have this child who then is going to go around, and I kind of call it the tornado child because they're getting into everything without finishing it. So it's a lot of like starting things. I'm starting something new here, but I can't finish it. I'm grabbing the markers out of here. Oh, look over here. Now I want to open the window. I hear the birds. Oh, I turned around. Oh, look, I touched this chair. So it's like parenting a child like this kind of feels like I'm cleaning up the markers, then I'm cleaning up this. No, don't touch that. It's like you can't keep up with this tornado that's sort of spinning around the room. And that's because the brainstem's like, wake up, wake up, wake up. And how am I going to wake up? I'm not going to wake up by sitting here and listening. I'm not going to wake up by lying down, right? So the child tries to do this. And then eventually what happens is the brainstem's like, well, this isn't working. So we are going to give up. Just like with the overwhelmed brainstem, when the child's trying to get away with the ears covered, this isn't working. So now I'm going to fight for my life, basically. With this child, this isn't working. I can't wake myself up. So I'm just going to lie on the ground. And I'm going to kind of give up, and then they become unmotivated. So if you have a child who kind of fluctuates between being kind of hyperactive and then just like, I'm not doing anything, kind of lying on the floor, like unmotivated, that is a sign that your child might have this underwhelmed brainstem. And again, it's over a period of time. Think about your child when they're young. It's going to be a pattern. And it's so sometimes it's not going to be necessarily like a one-off thing. It is going to be something that you consistently see. And that's why I want you to take some time and kind of think about what you believe your child's brainstem might be like. Going back to the underwhelmed brainstem, this child seeks out new things, likes things that are unpredictable, likes the novelty of it, likes arrhythmic swinging. So for example, a child or arrhythmic things. So for example, a child with an underwhelmed brainstem, when they get on the swings, they're going to be flipping, they're going to be spinning, they're going to be bouncing off things. A child with an overwhelmed brainstem might get on a swing and just move a little bit forward and back, like he doesn't want to do anything crazy. Okay, and so that can be the difference. That can be kind of a little bit hard to grasp. If there are any questions on that, I think it's hard to grasp at least. And what I think is really helpful at this point is even just thinking about if anybody wants to share like why they believe their child might be presenting as either underwhelmed brainstem or overwhelmed brainstem and why, that can be kind of helpful to kind of talk it out because it is a little bit sort of a new concept. The reason why this is important is because then when you go into developing a home program, your home program is going to focus on, okay, I know my child has this kind of regulation pattern, so I'm going to do these activities. I know my child has an underwhelmed brainstem, so I'm going to do these types of activities to support their regulation. And that's sort of the cognitive piece and the understanding piece that can really help you, even on the fly, be like, okay, I'm trying to wake my child's brainstem up. I know that. So these activities do that for this reason. And that can be really, really helpful. Even if you're listening to the recording, even pausing and starting to think about what you believe, like what are your child's characteristics? What are their behaviors? What are even like the triggers for meltdowns? You can start kind of tracking that. And sometimes the triggers can be really hard, but what happened? Was there something that was new? Did the grandparents come to visit and they had a really hard time? Were they doing like the same thing for like 2 hours and then they kind of lost it? Like, what is it that's going on there? Is there a chat about that?
We have one, overwhelmed, lays and stares at the ceiling.
Lays and stares at the ceiling. Okay, so I'm going to challenge you to think about what happens before that, because lays and stares at the ceiling could be that they don't want any more input in, and so they need something that's more predictable, something that's not changing. It could also be looking at the underwhelm brainstem. They have been trying to wake their brainstem up, and now they can't do it anymore, and their brainstem is just basically kind of like, we need to go to sleep. So just think about that. And again, you'll see it over and over and over. Now, if your child is on medication, it does mask this. I've also found that if your child has kind of like a big T trauma, it can also impact this kind of pattern presentation. Okay. Okay. Now, so when we're creating this kind of home program, we are figuring out what our child's regulation pattern is. Once we've figured that out, like let's say I think my child has an underwhelm or an overwhelm brainstem for these reasons. So I'm going to try this type of overwhelm brainstem home program. Now, if you get it wrong and your child's an underwhelm brainstem and you do like the overwhelm brainstem program, which I'm going to go into, that's fine. You will see just no impact. You're not going to like make your child more dysregulated. You will just see nothing. And then you do it a couple of times and you're like, I don't think this is working. And you flip it and you do the underwhelm brainstem presentation, then you might see something. Okay. Okay. So just quickly talking about there's 3 main things that we use in a home program. And again, this goes back to the more information that you have as a parent, the more you understand why you're doing something, the easier it is for you to put in different activities other than just the ones that are prescribed to you. And when ones are prescribed to you, you understand why you're doing it. So thinking about, there's 3 main kind of activities or inputs. I use activities here. It's the same thing as like input, what's coming into our body. There's proprioception, touch, and vestibular movement. Now, proprioception, a lot of people aren't sure what this is. This is how I feel my body. It's input into my joints and muscles. It's how we tell where our body is in space without looking at it. Like I can feel that my body is sitting right now. I don't have to look down to notice that my body is sitting. Now, some kids do because of the way that their brains work. And that's not necessarily a regulation brainstem processing difficulty. That's more of a skill discrimination, but that does impact proprioception. And then for touch, we're not talking about like tickle touch or with feathers. We're talking about deep touch. So deep, like pressure and touch, they really go together. Like I can't give somebody pressure into their joints and muscles without touching them, right? So we have deep touch. And then vestibular movement. Vestibular movement is how I move my head. So that could be side to side. It could be flipping over. It could be moving forward and back. It could be moving up and down. It has to do with my head. It tells me where my head is oriented in space because that's very important. That's how I see. That's how I hear. There's a lot of things in there. So I have to be able to understand where my head is in space. So you have where your body is in space, where your head is in space. And then touch is like, okay, I have this body, I have this skin that I can also feel. There are 3 neurochemicals, and you don't need to know this, but it can be helpful if you want to know why you are doing these things. It's because they flood your brain with neurochemicals, and these neurochemicals have specific jobs that have to do with regulating your brainstem. So when you give proprioception, your child is, so what that means is, so when I'm giving a child deep touch and pressure, or they are contracting their muscles, like they are running, they are biking, they are pushing, that releases serotonin, which is the happy neurochemical. It's like, I feel good, this is amazing. You can never have too much serotonin. So if you're not sure what to do, you can always have them be more active, like push you can push on them, that kind of thing. You focus on the proprioception. When you give deep touch, that releases dopamine. which is the calming neurochemical. And that helps to wash away cortisol that's built up, and adrenaline. So if your child is anxious, you're going to be focusing on deep touch because it releases dopamine and washes away that adrenaline and cortisol that's built up. That's the reason behind it. That's what that neurochemical does. And for histamine, when you do vestibular movement, so when I move my head, it releases histamine, and histamine is an alerting neurochemical, so it keeps the brainstem awake. And I use these three things, these three activities, these three inputs in a certain combination, whether my child has an overwhelm brainstem or an underwhelm brainstem, to help either calm it down or to keep it alert. So that's what you're essentially doing. You can add in music, you can add in smells, you can add in taste, you can add in all of that, but these are the three main things that are really going to flood your brainstem with these neurochemicals that over a period of time, if you're doing it consistently, which is what a home program is, you try to do it consistently and preventatively, so before a meltdown, then you're essentially helping to carve out a new pathway or strengthen a pathway that's really going to support regulation. Okay. All right, so putting this together, I know it's a lot, or it can feel like a lot. It might be good to even just go back to this part. If I have a child who has an overwhelmed brainstem, I am focusing on deep touch and proprioception because I'm releasing serotonin and dopamine, which again, wash away that cortisol and adrenaline. So if my overwhelmed brainstem that is telling me that I'm unsafe, I'm going to have this extra cortisol and adrenaline in there. I am going to consistently try to wash that out and create a pathway that uses that dopamine and serotonin so that I am happy, I feel good, I have that feel good neurochemical and that sort of calming down neurochemical. So when you choose activities, those are the two main kind of activities, types of activities you're going to do. Now for in your home program, for an underwhelm brainstem, I'm sort of doing the opposite. I'm trying to wake up the brainstem. So I'm going to focus on vestibular movement. So movement of my head, that could be like bending down, touching my toes. I'm going to go into examples in a minute. Spinning around, I'm moving my head because that releases histamine. And histamine is an alerting neurochemical. It wakes my brainstem up. And then I follow it up with proprioception. So that could be me pushing on the child or the child contracting their muscles. It releases serotonin, which actually helps to counteract histamine a little bit because histamine is very powerful and it can be a little bit overwhelming if you just do histamine. If you've ever been to an amusement park and you see all the kids melting down all over the place, it's because they're just like spinning around and flying all over the place. They're not contracting their muscles and the histamine sort of takes over and it can turn into kind of this wild, crazy town. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go over just some routine examples for overwhelm brainstem and underwhelm brainstem. This is a full routine. I have in this presentation kind of shortened it so that as a parent, when you're starting, you can just focus on like the two activities, the proprioception and deep touch for an overwhelm brainstem, and the vestibular movement and the proprioception for an underwhelm brainstem. Okay. So in the morning, let's say your child, okay, I've determined that my child's regulation pattern is an overwhelm brainstem, which means that they're more anxious, they're more controlling, they want everything a certain way, that kind of thing. They try to hide and then they lash out aggressively. So in the morning, if they're in bed, I always meet the child where they are. So I'm not going to get them out of bed and do something, or if they're already out of bed, I'm going to meet them where they are and what their energy level is. Like if they're already moving around, I'm not going to make them go back into bed, right? Like it has to fit into your routine. So I can give them, if they're already in bed, I can give them a burrito comforter. It's just basically, I take a comforter, a big comforter, and I wrap it around them. It gives them a lot of deep touch and that proprioception, which is exactly what you want. Or I could have them do a self hug if they want to do that, or I can do it to them. And the whole idea of this home program is you want to get as much of the body into this. Like I want to, if in this example, I want to give as much of the body touch, deep touch and proprioception as I can, because that's going to flood the brainstem with more neurochemicals. If I'm just touching my arm or my child's arm, that's not going to give me a lot of that neurochemical, like not a lot of dopamine. But if I have something all across my entire body, like a big comforter, and then maybe I'm laying on my child, they're hugging themselves, that's going to flood the system with dopamine. This is exactly what we want. Now, I have a slow head turn in there. This is the full thing. Again, you can totally do this, but for the sake of what I'm talking about, I'm going to jump to, then I'm just going to push the grown-up out of the room. So I start with like a burrito, hug, a lot of touch, a lot of pressure, and then I have to get them out of bed. So I might have them use their muscles, contract their muscles to get me out of the room, which releases serotonin. Okay, in the afternoon, this can be a little bit of a tricky time depending on how they're coming home from school, like what are the transitions, sort of like what's going on in their life, especially with an overwhelmed brainstem. If it's different pickups, that kind of thing can be very overwhelming. But they might get off the bus, let's say, and I might have them, okay, immediately go through like a little obstacle course, immediately jump around me, immediately kind of pick them up and hug them. Inside, if you can set up a place for crashes, which is basically like they're jumping off something into a pile of pillows. So think about what you have in your house. Do you have any big pillows? Do you have any big blankets? Can they jump off the couch and do that like 20 times, just consistently, like getting that input into their body? Not crazy, like spinny jumps, but just like crashing hard onto something that's really soft, gets a lot of pressure, a lot of deep touch into their body. And then if you can set up a cozy corner, like with a tent and pillows, I've had some success with this and some total not success with this. It depends on the child. Like my son won't go into a cozy corner because he feels left out. So he has to create it himself. And it's sort of like this moving place of a bunch of pillows and stuffed animals kind of thing. In the evening, I'm going to go over this because it's consistent. The evening never changes regardless of whether your child has an overwhelmed or an underwhelmed brainstem. So I'll go into this a little bit later. For an underwhelmed brainstem, it's the opposite. You're trying to wake up your brainstem. So again, if my child's in bed, I'm going to go over to them. I'm going to help rock them back and forth because I'm focusing on head movement, which is going to release histamine and start alerting my brainstem. Now, I could also have them reach up, stretch up, and then go down and touch their toes, up and touch their toes. It's a lot of head movement like this. I'm releasing histamine. I could also do just 10 big jumps if they're on the bed or on the way to the bathroom, whatever you're doing next. And then you can have them push you. I like this pushing a grown-up out of the bedroom because if you're with them, it's a very easy thing to do. Just push me out of the bedroom and I'm kind of resisting them and they're contracting their muscles. So again, I'm getting the histamine and the serotonin, kind of setting them up for the day. In the afternoon, instead of focusing on that proprioception and deep touch, I'm focusing on, again, the histamine. I want to wake them up so that they can last between like that 3 to 4 hour mark in like 7 p.m. So I'm going to have them, again, I can do the same thing. If they like jumping, I might do that 10 jumps, maybe spins, and then follow that up with some like body resistance. If they're pushing, if they're biking, not just like biking down a hill, but maybe biking like up a hill, biking around. If they're doing animal walks, they're really using their body, depending on what the child likes, that's really going to work. And again, for the evening, it's going to be the same exact routine. This could be 3 minutes, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 30 minutes. It is whatever you can do that works for you and your child. If you can do it consistently, start with 3 minutes and just do that, or 2 minutes every morning and put it as part of your routine. Okay, so what's sort of like the details of the home program that I went over? Again, you want to start small. You want to start with things that are in your home. It can help the entire family. Now, if you have one child who has an overwhelmed brainstem and a sibling who has an underwhelmed brainstem, those brainstems clash because they want totally different things. So if you have 2 children and you're wondering why they never get along, look at that, because their brainstem, one of them might be trying to wake up and be like kind of all over the place in everybody's space. And one of them might not want anybody in their space, might not want to be all over the place. And that can create a big conflict. And I've seen that many, many times. So just something to think about. You want to do it preventatively. So when a child's actually melting down and dysregulated, that really is too late to do this. Like if my child's kicking and screaming at me, I'm not going to be like, okay, I'm going to wrap you in a burrito, right? Like I'm probably going to get like punched in the face. So when your child is melting down and is that dysregulated, you just want to give them like object touch. So I want to give them touch through objects. And that can be where like a cozy corner can be helpful. Wherever my child is, for example, what I do when he's melting down like that, I will just gather a bunch of pillows. We have these huge pillows, all the stuffed animals, and just sort of pile it on top of him. And he can kind of rage through that, but at least I know he's getting touched because that's going to release dopamine and help calm down his brainstem without me getting hurt. And I certainly am not going to be talking or logicaling, which isn't a word, him through it because he's not accessing his cortex. Okay, so also keep that in mind. Okay, now, so what are you going to do first? Think of your child when they're age 3 to 5, when they're young, they don't have any compensatory strategies. What was the regulation pattern? Do you believe that they have a self-regulation disorder or a modulation disorder, like I mentioned in the beginning? Parents know best, like you have an inkling, you know what your child presents as, regardless of what anybody says. Like there's many times where I've been saying for years, my child's 6, since he was 3 or 2, I was like, something is different. And it took until last year, so that's 3 years of my life of me just saying that kind of over and over and over again. Like, you know what's going on with your child better than anybody else. And that's why you're the best person to be able to do this home program in a way that you understand why you're doing it. You use things in your home and it works for your whole family. Okay, so also what can be very helpful if you're unsure right off the bat what your child's regulation pattern is track what's going on for a week. Easier said than done. This is very hard for me, how I present, to do. But it can be very helpful because then you can say, oh yeah, they're always melting down right after school, or oh yeah, like getting out of bed in the morning is really, really hard. Or these are the triggers that I've been able to identify. What's the common thread between them? Because it's not going to be that you put the eggs on the wrong side of the plate. It's going to be that every time you don't put the food in the right space, like that can be a trigger, right? And also if I don't put the stuffed animals in the right space, or also if I move something in his room, that's the pattern of he or she or they are not able to control their environment. They're trying to do it. So that's what you're looking for with that. And then you can come up with, you think of what's the hardest time of day? Like, I want to start a home program. I'm not going to start doing it every hour or every part of the day. That might be too hard. So you pick the hardest time of day. What is the hardest time of day? Maybe it's like getting up in the morning. So I'm going to start with 3 minutes or 2 minutes or 5 minutes right there in the morning. And for like a week, 2 weeks, I'm just going to see how that plays out. Like, how are they doing at school? How are the next 2 or 3 hours for them? Are they more regulated? Are they less regulated? How long is it lasting? Maybe I need to do it more intensely to flood the brain with more neurochemicals so that they stay regulated for a longer period of time. Like, you're going to be the scientist here, but don't push yourself to do it every, like in the morning, in the afternoon, they come home, and in the evening. That's going to be pretty overwhelming. So again, it has to work with you, and you want to make sure that it is actually working. So just do one thing at a time. It's going to make it so much more efficient down the road. And if you know it works, I know this was a question. If you know it works, then at home and you're seeing results, then you can go to the school and say, this is what's working at home. This is exactly what I do. How can we implement something like this at home at these times of day? That's how you can get the school on board, because you know, and you're very confident in it, instead of being like, well, sometimes we use a weighted blanket and that kind of works, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes he doesn't want it, and I don't actually know why we're using it other than to like calm him down, but I don't know how to substitute out anything else because you don't necessarily understand the reasoning behind it. Now you do, you can be like, okay, what do you have there? Oh, you have a pillow? We can use that. Oh, you have, you don't have anything in the classroom? Can he go to the OT room like at this time and use that? What do you have there? Like that kind of thing. So you can become a much more effective advocate, I think, too. Okay, I'm almost done. I know I'm running out of time, sort of, almost. I'm going to
nighttime routine. Again, nighttime routine, regardless of whether your child's overwhelmed or underwhelmed brainstem, you will do this routine. And this is about getting a lot of touch in, a lot of proprioception in, and you're going to meet your child where they are. So you know that time of day, like after dinner, where your children go into this sort of like crazy wild mode, and it's very hard to get everyone to like calm down when you want them to. This is a way to gradually meet them where they are and then ease them into this.
Okay, so nighttime. I have a lot of parents who say that nighttime is really hard because their child sort of turns up the energy level instead of turns it down. And, you know, when I was growing up, what happened at nighttime was, with a lot of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s even, and before that, of course, is at nighttime, it was like, okay, now is the time that we calm down. Now is the time as we get prepared for bed. So you need to stop running around. You need to stop wrestling. You need to stop jumping. You need to just stop your body. And this goes back to, how do I connect with my child when they're kind of in this dysregulated state, or getting there, or always in it, or sometimes in it, whatever it is? How do I connect with them? And again, it goes a lot back to, okay,
take those societal rules and you kind of have to throw them out the window and just look at what's in front of you. So at nighttime, what happens is when children get tired, when anybody gets tired, what do? We have to move, because when we move our head, it releases histamine in our brain. And histamine is an alerting chemical to just stay awake. I have to move. I have to do something. And that can even start with me just like, fiddling with my hands, like tapping my foot. That's just a movement to distract my mind. But ultimately, what I'm trying to do is really to move my body, especially my head, so that I can release histamine and keep myself alert. Now, it's almost like when you get really tired, and especially with kids, because they have no compensatory strategies, they don't have a lot of inhibition, is that you'll see this huge uptick in like kind of this big energetic state, this big wild state before bed in the evening, because they're getting tired and their brain's like, okay, children always do what their brainstem needs. So the brainstem's like, hey, you're getting really sleepy, you're going to fall asleep, like you have to wake up, so move. So then you get this movement, but it's not often purposeful because it's directed by the brainstem. And so the brainstem's just like, you need to move. So the kid's like, okay, I'll just move. And then it's like this wild, and it feels wild. It's not this, okay, let's engage in this game of like tag where there's rules and we can go back and forth. It's not like that. Oftentimes it's just like flipping off the couch, like running into each other, jumping, like sprinting around, like yelling. It's just, it feels very crazy. Okay, so what you're going to do, and I know I'm out of time. Okay, so
I have another video here of how to wrestle. So you're going to try in the evening to put in wrestling. If you can do like 20 minutes and you think about the amount of time that it takes you to be like, okay, kids, calm down, like let's get our stuff. And you're talking and talking and talking. How much time that takes is probably more than 20 minutes of you being like, all right, okay. Turn that into wrestling. But there's rules with the wrestling. So it's not like you're flipping and really like hurting each other. You're both on your hands and knees and you're just trying to push into each other. You're trying to kind of get each other down. Your goal is to get in a lot of proprioception and a lot of deep touch, because that's going to help calm down the brainstem and prepare you for bed. If you know joint compressions, you can also do those, which can help. But again, you're meeting your child where they are. So when they're really energetic, they're kind of crazy running around, you can wrestle with them and you'll often see a little bit of an uptick in the energy. And then they'll eventually, when there's neurochemicals start flooding the brain, they naturally calm down and get ready for bed, which is really, really nice. Do I have time to show just I think this is like 1.5 minutes?
I think so. And then we do have 2 questions that came in earlier.
Okay. So I'll show, is that okay if I show this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll show this. So this is just me with my son, maybe a year or 2 ago, I think 2 years ago, and he's pretty dysregulated and I have a voiceover. So I'm sort of.
So in this clip, I am wrestling with my son, and you can see I'm trying to get as much touch as I can in as possible. That's deep touch and it's consistent. He's a little bit dysregulated here. So it's harder to do when your child is dysregulated. It just takes a little bit more effort. But you can see I'm doing a lot of squeezes, a lot of deep pressure. In the way he is wrestling right now, he doesn't want to be down on all fours. He wants to jump and run around. So for joint compressions, basically you're just putting a lot of input into every joint. So I start with the head. I count to 8. You can do 8 to 10 times. I stabilize the joint that's closest to the body, and then I push the other joint in. Conversely, you can also do traction, which is exactly the opposite, which I don't show here. These are joint compressions. I do all the major joints, and then I go to his feet. He actually asks me to do his feet here. And then I usually push it right into his hips, or you can push his feet onto the floor, and then I squeeze his hips too.
Okay, so you can see that there, it's not working that great because he's dysregulated. So again, it's important to do a lot of this preventatively. You know, I should have known it's getting nighttime. You can always feel it when your child's starting to get dysregulated. I should have started this like 20 minutes before, but I didn't. And you can just hear his voice. It's high pitched. He's doing a lot of giggling. He's trying to jump around and kind of get that adrenaline going, because a lot of kids, when they're in that baseline state where they have more cortisol and adrenaline, they're used to that. So they want to keep themselves there. It's not comfortable for us, for anybody, to go into kind of like a more relaxed state if we've never been there, right? Okay, So that is it. Now I know that there are some questions. I will try to look at them.
Well, these came in through the registration. One of them was asking about a teenager who has vision impairment along with vestibular dysfunctions. Do you have any additional ideas or tools that you might use for maybe an older child and then the vision impairment for calming and focus?
Yes. So for an older child, you can use these same principles, but you have to adapt it to what they feel comfortable with, what they like. So it's a lot of, do you like this? Do you want me to give you more pressure? It's a lot of questions like, how does this feel in your body? And while you're doing this for the first month, usually you're the one who's regulating your child. So the whole idea behind this home program idea is that I am regulating my child. You are there. And then over a period of time, you'll notice that your child's not asking for it as much, or they're staying regulated for longer, with the idea that eventually you're carving this new pathway. So, 2-3 months down the road, and usually I see kids start to regulate about 3 weeks later. This also depends on some other foundational factors that I did not go into here, like diet and things like that. But given that everything else foundationally is there and supporting, you can start regulating. That was off topic. So yes, you can use the same things for the older kids, but just have to adapt it, same principles to what they like. In terms of vision impairment, the way I look at it, it is a skill, not vision impairment, but in terms of vestibular skills, vision is related to vestibular movement. So if you're going to develop those skills, what I like to do with any sort of visual vestibular difficulty is start by just strengthening the most inner ear part of the inner ear, which is sort of like the basic most part of the vestibular system, just by doing linear movements. It depends on if your child gets dysregulated. If they get dysregulated, it's a little bit harder to do, or you have to go really slow, but just linear movements like up and down, side to side. Sorry, this is forward and back, and side to side movements, either by just rocking. They can jump. If you have a trampoline and they don't get dysregulated, you can do that for 3 minutes every day, and it strengthens that foundational part of the vestibular system. That's where I would go first, but it also depends on regulation. And yes, so what did this look like for a teenager? Yeah, it's very similar. You have to figure out what your teenager likes. It's the same principle. So if they have an overwhelm brainstem, you're going to figure out, okay, like what, and some kids, they're so not used to touch, especially when they have an overwhelmed brainstem, that any kind of touch can be very uncomfortable for them. So you have to start again where they are. So they might really crave deep touch, like deep down, that's what their brainstem needs, but you might not be able to give that to them right away because they're not used to touch. So you might have to just go like really lightly, like with the pillow. And you can say like, what are you comfortable with? You have to be able to just tailor it on your own. I've done the same exact stuff I did in here. I've done with up to 24-year-olds. And like asking them if they liked it. If it's what their brainstem needs, then I've never had, like, they enjoy it. They really do. Do you want me to read the last question here?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Would this method work if it is only done on some days? I work with a child who splits time between mom and dad's house. 50-50. I know one household would use this technique, but the other probably wouldn't. Yeah, so I've come across this too. Obviously, the more consistently you do it, more intensely, the more frequently, the faster the brainstem is going to change. Sometimes what happens, like if one parent's doing it and the other's not, you just focus on that one parent, get them to do that. And then when that parent sees results, or they can start videoing, like this is oftentimes what I have, especially if it's a contentious relationship, I'll have the one parent who's doing it do videos of the child and be like, this is what I'm doing. This is what I see. Can you try this at your house too? Sometimes that they do, and sometimes they don't. You just have to start where you know it's going to work. If that works at that parent's house, then I also try to bring it to the school, so they're getting it during the day also. Yeah, it's hard, right? Like you want it to be done every day for like a certain amount of time, 3 weeks a month. Yeah.
Great. And there was another question earlier that I think you have covered. The question was, what if a child wakes up dysregulated or is rarely regulated at home? And you gave some good strategies about the burrito and pushing out of the room.
Yeah.
Is there anything else to add for that?
I think that just knowing that is really empowering. Like my child wakes up dysregulated, which is really hard because I've been there, and it's just, for me, it felt very like, I honestly dreaded when my child woke up because it was full on from the moment they woke up. So it's like planning ahead, right? Like, okay, at nighttime, if they have, for example, an overwhelmed brainstem, do they have like a weighted blanket on there? Are they sleeping with the stuffies, whatever they feel comfortable with? So they're getting a lot of deep pressure and touch overnight. So I think about, like, if they wake up dysregulated, what can I do through the nighttime to help them regulate? And then I'm sort of like prepared because it can be really challenging when you wake up and your child's dysregulated and you're not ready, or you have to go in there and they're already dysregulated. So I can't necessarily do what I want to do with them to help them regulate. So I would back it up, start it at night. And then, yeah, it can be really hard. I'm not going to lie. I don't have a great suggestion other than to start it at night. Try to even back it up to the evening before and see how that works. So when they wake up, okay, maybe they'll be like not as dysregulated and I can do a little bit more with them.
Great. And maybe in the last minute, is there anything you could offer? Somebody is asking, well, they realize this presentation has largely been about at home. They want to know how to bridge or translate to educators at school.
Yes. So I do actually have a few presentations like on this specifically if someone's interested. But again, I find that when you're able to do it at home, because parents also, they kind of face like the brunt of the dysregulation because kids usually feel the most comfortable at home. So they're going to be fully dysregulated in their wholeness at home versus at school. They'll probably try to hold it together a little bit more because of peers and the rules and everything else. So if you know that this works at home and you see results, then I like to have parents like video it, show it to the teacher, send it to the teacher. This is what we're doing at home. Is there something that we can do at school? Or talking to the OT and being like, the more information that you have and the more confident you come into the school, the more I found that they're like, okay, yeah, we can do this. Instead of being like, oh, well, do you have a weighted blanket? Maybe you could do this when he like at this time of day, but you're not really sure why or what's going to happen, or you think it will help, but maybe it won't, that kind of thing. So I like to start it at home, even with the morning time. This is what I do in the morning. This is what I see. He seems to be regulated for this amount of time. I think we should try it when he first gets to school to continue this regulation. Like, what do you guys have? That's what I found to be the most helpful versus like just going to the school and being like, this is what we tried at home, but it doesn't necessarily consistently work. And I don't know why I do it, that kind of thing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Natalie. This information has been very helpful. Everyone should see a link in the chat for the evaluation. If you could please take a few minutes to complete it so we can make improvements and fulfill our grant requirements, that would be great. We do have some more workshops coming up, and you can find details about those on the homepage of our website, which is vermontfamilynetwork.org, along with the links to the previously recorded ones. We have tons of information on our website, and getting connected with us is easy. You can follow us on Facebook or join our closed Facebook page if you are a parent. We have 2 closed groups, one for all parents of children with disabilities, special health needs, and one for those with adult children. You can also sign up for our monthly e-news or check out our YouTube channel. We are here to help, so please contact us by phone or email. And thank you everyone for joining. And thanks again, Natalie. This presentation was wonderful. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.